Well, I'd like to bring in Andrew Bacevich, who's just joined us in Boston, retired colonel and Vietnam War veteran. His latest book is titled America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. So, Professor Bacevich, could you comment? You last month attended the Commander-in-Chief Forum, which took place on the USS Intrepid aircraft carrier. Could you tell us what happened at that forum and what that tells you about the way in which foreign policy and national security issues are being talked about in this campaign season?
Well, it was a great missed opportunity because the moderated interviews, first with Hillary Clinton and then with Donald Trump, basically were a waste of time. The candidates were never asked the sorts of questions that Americans need to hear about with regard to national security. So, for example, there was no discussion of President Obama's planned trillion-dollar modernization of our nuclear arsenal, whether or not that's a good idea, a bad idea, necessary and inflammatory. There was no discussion about what we might learn from our post-9/11 wars in the greater Middle East, particularly Iraq and Afghanistan, but not limited to those two. Those wars have obviously been unsuccessful. What should we learn from them, and how would those lessons apply to either a Trump administration or a Clinton administration going forward? So again, I think it was really a terrible missed opportunity.
One thing that wasn't commented on, this was an NBC forum, Matt Lauer was the moderator, was even that this discussion about foreign policy took place on a warship, you know, in the New York harbor. I mean, even for the military and veterans, isn't the military the last resort, really the failure of civilization not to be able to resolve its problems, but to hold it on the Intrepid? Your thoughts on this, Professor Bacevich?
Well, you're making a very good point. And of course, our politicians do ritually talk about the military being a last resort. But any examination of U.S. policy, not simply since the end of the Cold War, since 9/11, but I think more broadly since the end of the Cold War, would suggest otherwise, that the military has become the preferred option as far as American statecraft is concerned. Why? Because of expectations in Washington, shared by both parties, shared by both of these two presidential candidates, that somehow or other military power offers the most effective way to achieve our purposes. And this notion persists despite the accumulation of evidence that suggests otherwise. I mean, the evidence suggests that the American reliance on American military power has been enormously costly, both in terms of lives lost, lives shattered, dollars wasted, with very little to show in terms of positive results. But I think it's really tragic and a judgment on our politics that these accumulating military failures simply don't get the kind of scrutiny that they deserve, even here in the middle of a presidential election.
Well, Professor Bacevich, you mentioned earlier that there was no discussion of nuclear issues at that forum on the USS Intrepid, but you've also written a piece on the first presidential debate and the failure of both Trump and Clinton to respond to a very specific question that the moderator, Lester Holt, addressed to them about the long-standing U.S. policy on first use. So can you say exactly what happened when that question was posed last week?
Yeah, sure. So this is Lester Holt, who moderated in the first direct debate between the two candidates, and he asked a question that basically said the following: President Obama has been considering a change to the U.S. policy on nuclear first use. Do you agree with the current policy? and this gets into a little bit of nuclear theology, because first use has a very specific meaning in that context. And what it means is that the United States, for decades now, has adhered to a policy that basically says we will not restrict our use of nuclear weapons to responding to a nuclear weapons attack. That restriction is called no first use. They will only use nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear weapons attack. So Obama supposedly thought about changing this policy, decided not to. Lester Holt wanted to know what the two candidates thought. He asked Trump first, and Trump's meandering answer basically suggested that Trump, had no idea about what the phrase first use means. That's troubling. When the question then was tossed to Secretary Clinton, she basically changed the subject. She avoided any discussion of U.S. nuclear policy and U.S. nuclear strategy. And again, to me, their failure to address Lester Holt's question in a serious way robbed the American people of an opportunity to reflect on one of these core issues related to U.S. nuclear strategy.
Well, can you also outline, you've explicitly stated some of your concerns about Trump's foreign policy positions, to the extent that you can identify any consistency on them, in particular on Iraq and his comments about how the U.S. should have taken the oil, et cetera, and also Clinton's foreign policy, her tenure as Secretary of State, her position on Libya, her subsequent defense of her position on Libya, and what that might indicate about the position she's likely to take if she becomes president on Syria, on ISIS, et cetera?
Well, I think, frankly, it's impossible for us to gauge what a Trump foreign policy would look like. He is, by and large, uninformed. He's strategically illiterate. He knows as much about national security policy as I know about running a business, and what I know about running a business is next to nothing. And the problem, I think, one of the problems with the media coverage of the campaign, the way the mainstream media has covered it, is that the appalling prospect of a Trump presidency has caused the campaign to be about Trump. The imperative of revealing simply how ill-prepared he is for the office, of revealing how uncouth he is, his sketchy relationship with truth, and therefore the discussion of the campaign hasn't really admitted any debate, serious debate, over over the national security issues that we really do confront. As for Secretary Clinton, it seems to me she is very much a mainstream, hawkish, liberal internationalist. The most significant aspect of her tenure as Secretary of State, in my judgment, is certainly not the Benghazi episode, but was her support for the intervention in Libya to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, which succeeded in doing that and basically turned Libya into a failed state that was not then became subject to a new jihadist franchise. Her record very much deserves close examination. My own sense is that if she becomes president, and I expect that she will become president, is that we will find very little change in the trajectory of U.S. policy, in the excessive militarization of U.S. policy. I see very little indication that she has a sort of creative intellect that will lead her to ask serious questions about that trajectory, and we're going to get more of the same, and more of the same is not good enough.
Well, very quickly before we wrap, Professor Bacevich, could you just outline some of the questions you were critical of the mainstream media, the questions that you think the candidates should have been asked on foreign policy? You mentioned a couple on nuclear issues. What about the others?
Well, I think one question has to do with what is the authorization, what is the authority under which the president continues to conduct our wars in the greater Middle East, specifically the new war in Iraq against ISIS and U.S. involvement in the civil war in Syria. Nominally, the authorization is the document that was passed by the Congress in the immediate wake of 9/11. That document said that the president was authorized to go after parties that perpetrated 9/11. Well, obviously, the Assad regime didn't perpetrate 9/11. ISIS didn't perpetrate 9/11. It didn't exist at the time. So I think we really ought to have a serious discussion over who says that we should be at war and why doesn't the Congress exercise any serious voice in that regard, as the Constitution of the United States calls for. That would be one very important question, I think, that deserves to be at the forefront of this discussion.